Hello, my name is Delphine Kirk. I'm a senior at the University of Baltimore, and today we're going to be talking about my study, Pop-Up Jungles, Houseplants in Quarantine. So the first thing we need to do is talk about anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is the tendency to ascribe human cognition and qualities to non-human things. For instance, if you've ever given your car a name or said that your computer was fighting with you, that's anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism has been linked to hoarding disorders, gambling, and purchase of products. In each of the studies above, distress tolerance, that is, how well someone deals with distressing feelings, or loneliness or social exclusion, played a role. The idea being that people anthropomorphize objects in an attempt to make up for a lack of social support and connectedness with other people. For instance, in the gambling study conducted by Pancani et al. In 2019, they induced feelings of social exclusion via a virtual ball game, where participants were either given an equal number of passes as the virtual AI, or given 2 passes of the ball and then ignored. Participants were then presented with a gambling machine, which was either described in anthropomorphic terms, with the ability to make decisions and she/her pronouns, or as being controlled by an algorithm and with neutral it pronouns. Both excluded subjects and subjects exposed to anthropomorphism gambled more, and there was a significant interaction between the two variables. That is, if you were both excluded and subjected to anthropomorphism, you were likely to gamble even more. Leading into the current study, Gloucester in 2020 found that one of the main common factors in mental health during the pandemic was social support, and this got me thinking, would distress or loneliness caused by COVID-19 and the surrounding social changes impact a person's anthropomorphic tendency and therefore their purchase tendency? I decided to study a particular industry in order to narrow things down a little, and that begs the questions, why did I choose plants? In general, plants tend to be studied in terms of improving mood or helping people to cope. For instance, Toda et al. Performed a study in which they placed a small plant on a worker's desk to see if that would improve their mood at work. But I'm not trying to show that plants improve mood or help people cope. I wanted to know why people would be purchasing them. And it turns out plants as a commodity is a booming industry. In 2018, millennials, that is people between roughly the ages of 18 and 35, were responsible for a quarter of all horticultural sales. In 2018 to 2019, spring sales increased for 68% for garden centers, and in 2019 to 2020, this number rose to 87%. Furthermore, 71% of garden centers reported a significant increase in sales specifically due to COVID-19. But the most interesting thing I found in the horticultural literature was something that McGinnis called a plant parent, a person who treats plants in a similar way to a child or pet, something they attribute specifically to millennials in which the horticultural industry is desperate to tap into as a buying base. And you only need to look as far as the houseplant section of Reddit to see this in action. Baby pictures, family photo, added to my family, and these are plants. So the question became not just, will mental health impacts from COVID-19 change buying tendency, but specifically, are people who show higher anthropomorphic tendency more likely to buy houseplants, and if so, will they also show higher levels of loneliness and lower levels of distress tolerance? So my hypotheses are these. I will believe there will be a significant increase in houseplants owned between February 2020 and the date of survey completion. I believe that participants who score more highly on acquisition tendency, that is, how likely they are to buy plants, will show a greater increase in number of houseplants owned. I believe that participants who score highly on anthropomorphic tendency, that is, how often and how strongly they anthropomorphize objects, will show a greater increase in number of houseplants owned. I believe that anthropomorphic tendency will be significantly positively correlated with acquisition tendency. That is, the more likely they are to anthropomorphize their plants, the more likely they are to buy them. And I believe the anthropomorphic tendency will be negatively correlated with distress tolerance. That is, the better someone handles distress, the less likely they are to anthropomorphize. And positively correlated with loneliness. The more lonely someone is, the more likely they are to anthropomorphize. Participants were recruited using either the University of Baltimore research pool, in which case they were awarded 0.5 research credits toward a class of their choice, or via social media, in which case they weren't compensated. Out of 202 responses I received, 154 were valid, 46 were incomplete, and 2 were removed for being potential outliers. Out of my participants, ages ranged from 18 to 68 with a mean of about 28, And of those that chose to give their age, 92.1% were 40 or younger, which falls in line with previous data seen in the horticultural industry. We also had an overwhelming amount of female respondents in comparison to other genders, and in terms of who among our participants owned houseplants, about 77.9% did own houseplants, while 22.1% did not. I used 4 different scales in my survey, with each one being measured on a Likert scale from 1 being strongly disagree to 5 being strongly agree in order to keep things consistent. I used the distress tolerance scale, which measured ability to handle distressing situations or feelings of upset, and uses items such as my feelings of distress or being upset scared me, and I would do anything to avoid feeling distressed or upset. I then used the UCLA loneliness scale, which includes items like I could not tolerate being so alone or I felt starved for company. The acquisition tendency scale, which includes items like I feel almost compelled to acquire more houseplants or it makes me feel good to see my collection grow. And the Graves anthropomorphic test scale, which includes items such as my houseplants have done things just to annoy me or my houseplants are my friends. So for the actual procedure, participants first answered a demographic questionnaire, and then they were asked to think back to their feelings during the past year and complete the distress tolerance scale and the loneliness scale. Halfway through, they were given a plant ownership check and basically asked whether they had owned plants during the past year or not, and those who indicated they had not were automatically directed to the end of the survey. For part 2, the plant owners only gave a measure of plants owned in February 2020 and at the time of the survey, and then were asked to complete the acquisition tendency scale and the Graves anthropomorphic test scale. In terms of results, almost all of my hypotheses were supported. We did see a significant increase in number of houseplants owned from February 2020 to present, with a mean increase of about 11.7. There was a significant positive correlation between change in houseplants owned and acquisition tendency, as expected. However, there was not a significant correlation between change in houseplants owned and anthropomorphic tendency. Further, anthropomorphic tendency was positively correlated with acquisition tendency, positively correlated with loneliness, and negatively correlated with distress tolerance. We also found an unexpected but interesting result in that distress tolerance scores for those who reported owning plants were significantly higher versus those who did not. So what can we say about this study? Well, it supports past research, that is, loneliness and distress tolerance both correlated with anthropomorphic tendency in a way that I expected it would, and anthropomorphic tendency in turn correlated with acquisition or purchase in a way that I thought it would. Why was hypothesis 3 not supported? Well, it may not be enough to have strong anthropomorphic tendency. One must also have strong acquisition tendency in order to actually purchase more belongings, in this case plants. This would require further research to actually show definitively. Can this research help to explain the boom of the horticultural industry within the past year? We can't say anything about causation because this is correlational research, but we can say that stress tolerance and loneliness were correlated with anthropomorphic tendency, which is in turn correlated with acquisition tendency, which may explain where some of the buying is coming from. We also saw distress tolerance scores being higher among those who owned plants than those who did not, which was an unexpected finding and would also require more research to see in what ways it might influence the results that I got. So as you can see, the opportunities for further research are pretty wide. For instance, this survey only has 1 data point. For a future study, it would be ideal to administer the survey multiple times in order to be able to compare answers across time, instead of what was done in this survey where we asked participants to think back to the entire past year and rate their feelings on that year. We also need to address issues of response drop-off. Participants tended to stop answering the survey after the first scale measure, and we would need to find a way to keep them better engaged. This survey was not experimental. Anthropomorphic tendency and acquisition tendency can't be randomly assigned since they're both personality traits, but we can manipulate them experimentally, as prior research shows, and that would be the next step. The role of attachment also wasn't examined in this survey, but previous research has shown that an anxious attachment in particular has links to anthropomorphic tendency, and that would be one thing to add in a further research study. Can this be applied to other industries? Obviously, I looked at one specific industry in order to narrow things down a little and make it easier to design a study, but it would be interesting to apply this to other industries, especially other hobby industries such as knitting, book collecting, toy collecting, something of that nature, to see whether anthropomorphic tendency can be expanded beyond just hoarding and gambling in terms of purchase tendency. And these are my references. Thank you so much, and I'm willing to answer any questions you may have.